Hello and welcome to our series where we're getting into conversation with leaders in IT and agility about subjects that they're passionate about. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Ketan Varia. Ketan is a management consultant, author and director at Kinetic Solutions, where he assists large organizations with operational excellence and transformational change. Indeed, that's part of the conversation that we're going to have today. Ketan has a wealth of international and sector experience running improvement projects with many organizations, including, but certainly not limited to, and check me if I get any of these wrong, Ketan, Hertz, the Office for National Statistics, EMI Music, ADP, and the nation's Trust Bank, and even the NHS. Ketan is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transportation, and a chartered engineer. So out of all of that, there are many things that we could be talking about today, I'm sure. But particularly, we're talking about Ketan's work developing methods and approaches for bringing creative thinking into organizations to help them solve challenges. And our discussion today is actually around the use of improv to collaborate and make leaps in innovation and business change. So welcome, Ketan. Absolutely delighted to have you here talking about improv.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you very much for inviting me along to this conversation.
I'm very much delighted to. I'm looking forward to this one. Quite literally could go anywhere, I would imagine.
Absolutely.
Perhaps it's useful, actually, just with that in mind, perhaps it's useful to just start a definition. When we talk about improv, what does that mean for you? How would you describe what improv is or what that means?
Well, first of all, improv is a genre. It comes from theatre, and from my understanding of it, it's when actors and actresses were, as part of the preparation, improv was used to make them flexible, to make their mind flexible and more creative. So in the theatre world, improv often was used as a way of creating a situation or a story where nobody knew what the outcome was. So things were made up spontaneously, scenes were made up spontaneously to get actors to fit into the right roles and just get them more versatile. It really, very much in the 70s, a guy called Keith Johnson made it, a well-named genre, and he wrote a book about it. And people picked up this theme of improv, which for me are kind of mainly four things. One is around being spontaneous, just doing what comes in the moment. It's about collaboration, working with the other person. It's about accepting fear of failure and letting go, because you will make mistakes. You will say something that you didn't expect to say, and accepting that and using that as a way of making even bigger leaps in your creativity. And really, and fourth, I think it's very much about listening and being part of a team. So really being aware and being in that moment.
Okay, so thank you. And no doubt we'll come on to much more of that in a second, and its relationship with business, although I think you've already started to hint at some of the reasons why this could be so effective. One of the principles of improv, or is this a principle of improv, that you switch your mindset to a positive one? So what I mean by that is it's a conversation, and it's, as you say, people are making things up, but you're not judging or restricting the thinking. By intention, you're opening up, you're switching yourself to a yes position to whatever happens in the conversation.
Correct. So just before I answer that, Stephen, let me just bring the story to now from kind of the background to improv.
Yeah. Okay.
That I stated. So following on from that work in the theatre, improv started to be used in business contexts. It has started to be used as a therapy tool. It started to be used as an event, as a fun thing where people get together and do some improv, even whether they're from the theatre or not. So it started to be used in many types of environments, and moving away from the theatre world. And that's where I came across it, where I did a course on improv at the City Lit 2013. And then I thought this was very powerful, and then started to created kind of my own improv classes, which I've been running for 2.5 years. And to your question as to why it's so powerful and so positive, is that particularly in the business world and in the professional world, we're there because we're experts at something. We're there because we're supposed to give the right answer. We're there because we also have a fear of being judged by our peers all the time, because we've reached, those professional ladders, and we've reached some sort of a status. What that does do is obviously gives us status. It opens doors for us, but sometimes it can stop creative thinking. It can stop us building what others are doing. It can get us into a mode of going for the answer, which is the most obvious answer from our experience, and not actually exploring that there may be another 22 answers. And actually, our answer is not a bad answer, but there may be a better answer. So this isn't saying that our life experience is no good and we need to throw it away. It's saying it's very good. But what we want to do is join all those dots of a life experience in a much more meaningful way.
Understood. So we take that life experience, and then with that kind of positive framing, as you said, none of that gets thrown away. All of that is included, but we don't restrict ourselves to that. You're not just in this role. And that echoes certainly that many of the people I work with or see, we're all working off in these kind of complex adaptive systems right now, where there is no right answer anyhow. There's only an answer that will produce something and have some impact. So presuming that experience will deliver the person with the right answer to your particular situation is unfortunately a naive and rather short-lived response in most organizations.
Correct. And I think with your experience in the Agile world, Stephen, and maybe I'd love to know your views on this. From what I know, Agile does very much say, look, let's take the problem and let's move it forward. Let's discover more. At that point, we'll reconvene and decide what the next step is, right? Because that space to go and explore may take it to somewhere new, right? Because you haven't planned it into a milestone by milestone approach. You just say, let's move forward.
Totally. We accept that we can't predict the future, and therefore we organize ourselves in a way that we are free and flexible to adapt. So you can do that at a team level. Most people are familiar with Scrum and say like a typical standard anyway, 2-week iteration in Scrum where you make those kind of moves. But in a larger way, in organizations, they do the same sort of thing. Facebook famously have got, or say famously, but Facebook's approach to strategy, for example, is to say, we definitely want to go that way somewhere, but we organize ourselves in quarters such that each 3 months, we've got a chance to see if we're still going in the right direction. And you're right, there's nobody coming up with a master plan that says, here's the blueprint for things. So any opportunity to bring other ideas into an environment which you can't predict the future, you don't know what you're working in, sounds very positive indeed. So perhaps let's switch to business. Talk a little bit about the contexts or where you've used or how you've been effective using improv in organizations.
Sure. Well, I would say that probably from my experience, my background's in change management. As you alluded to earlier on. So I've very much looked at it from that experience and how I can connect improv to that area.
Yep.
And I would say that there are 4 things. One is when you, as an organization, looking at strategy and looking to move forward in your strategy, what you're often looking around strategy is to connect disparate things and create something new, So, for example, an organization, maybe in a certain sector where they're not using enough virtual tools, and actually connecting that sector with virtual tools create something quite powerful, maybe a completely new experience, and so on. So it's when you're shaping strategy, how you can connect different things, different experiences that the organization has to come to something new. That's one. The other one is, your straightforward problem solving, where you have some issue, some problem, but rather than go through the obvious answers based on experience, is to look at that problem a lot more broadly. So for example, we often do that is we take the problem and we do a variety of things to it. One, we might take it to a different place, the same problem to a different place, and see how you might solve it there. Or you might introduce some random words or some random characters into that problem and see how might they look at it. So as a quick test on this, can you give me a typical problem that an organization might face?
Sure. Let's pick on, say, one of the things I said, a leader talking about the fact that their teams don't take ownership. They're annoyed that their team just doesn't stand up and kind of step in.
Great. So we may create a scene where you have a leader and a couple of people where those two people are kind of shying away from taking ownership, right? And we might act that out a little bit, but then we might move it to a different place. So we might move it to, let's say, to Mars, where this person is trying to build a building on Mars with his people, and he's really struggling, or she's really struggling. And see why is that? What's the struggle about? And we may find that the struggle in Mars is to do with oxygen, is maybe lack of oxygen, or maybe the environment, and maybe those underlying issues are the same issues we have on Earth, right? So by changing context, we might discover something new. The other thing we may do is within this team, we might bring a new person in, right? Or have, if this leadership is around, say it's an IT company with some leadership issues, we might bring it into a busy kitchen with the leader having some leadership issues, and then we might introduce some characters in there, like a chef or whatever, to see, well, how might this shape it? Or we might take this issue and bring in something quite random. So they have this leadership issue around, people not taking ownership, but at the same time as that, they have an issue about the way the canteen works for staff, right? And see what's the connection with that. What's the story that's being played out? So it's really changing context, right, and changing characters that might bring some new insight into the problem. That's one tool, but there are many others. And then just finishing off your question. So I talked about connecting strategy, disciplining strategy. I talked about problem solving. The third thing is how to create an environment where people work more effortlessly. They work better as a team because that fear of failure is not built in, right? They can bounce things off each other. They feel that they're more open to accepting new ideas. And Improv very much creates a collaborative environment because of the ground rules it has in the first place. It allows the ability to fail. And a lot of the improv games we play at the start are around that kind of failure, getting stuck, building on other people's ideas. That creates such a nice fluidity that means that you can continue to work with those people on the real problem in the same fluid way. And I mean, on this, I might ask you, Stephen, of your experience of improv, because I know when you came along to my improv session, you were with people you never met before, right?
Yeah,
and
I was.
You were given some tasks to do, right? So how did that go?
Very good. I joined one of Ketan's public sessions, inviting people internationally across the globe to be able to come along and run a session. It was really interesting because you're being asked to come up with ideas, or rather share thoughts in a group of people that you've never met before, but the subjects that you're talking about put everybody in that same context. So it's not like you're entering a room where everybody already knows what the answer is and you've just come in late. You're all, in every conversation, you're all experiencing something new. And it was kind of one of the reflections I took afterwards. I'm a fairly extroverted, open person. I would normally be the first person up at karaoke, much to the chagrin of everybody in the room, right? But the fact that there was something so novel about every single one of the conversations meant that even people who had done it before, we were all in a novel position every single time. So it removed some of that baggage, and I really enjoyed that outcome from it. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and would strongly recommend anyone to come along and join your session too. Really would.
Great. So I mean, I think that's a good example of the third point, which is how people can collaborate, right?
Yes.
And I think the fourth thing I was going to say is very much in here. This fear of failure, and I think again in the business world, as you do well, and as you rise, and as you become more successful, this fear of failure can be a big weight on you. And what improv does is, because the stories, the games are set up in a way that you will fail sometimes. You won't know what to say. You say the wrong thing, which make people laugh or not, and that's completely okay. And in our mindset, if we can let go of failure, it means it just removes a massive weight from us. Now, that doesn't mean we're trying to deliberately try to fail. We're not deliberately trying to fail.
No,
right?
no, quite.
Thinking about, that it's not saying that, I'm going to fail because I'll be unprepared and whatever happens, right? But it's actually saying, well, if something doesn't work out, I'm going to learn from it and then let go and keep going, right?
Yes.
And what that means is a few things, which is you can then aspire to greater heights because you haven't got this big weight on you. And the second thing is that you're not relying on your successes only. You're relying on other things because there are other things to go to.
I meet this, and I hadn't thought about improv in this context at all before this conversation, but I talk about psychological safety as the theme in teams of, well, frankly, one of the major impediments to most groups. Problem number one is normally they don't know where they're going, followed by 2, they don't feel like they've got the space, the autonomy, or the freedom to be able to do something about it. That's safety. Google's famous Project Aristotle a few years back put psychological safety as the number one indicator for team performance. The thing I hadn't connected, though, was that idea that, sure, I've run a few kind of cock-up sessions. You can be as rude as you like with that phrase, where people come along and talk about how they failed, but that always puts it in a kind of work context. You don't get when you talk about other behaviors in an organization, you want to build habits. So I wonder if using a technique like improv on a regular basis helps build it's all right to fail, as you say, or it's all right to nobly fail in the pursuit of something great. That's fine. Recklessness is never fine, but this is.
Yes.
Have you seen that have that effect? Have you seen an organization pick up improv as a kind of a regular tool that they use such that they kind of build some habits, or do you tend to see it more used as like a precision tool from time to time, used when we've got to get over a particular hurdle? We'll use that. Do you see what I'm saying? Rather an everyday thing that's part of the habit of how we work here, or is it more of a targeted technique?
Yeah. So it's really interesting. If you look at certain organizations, so for example, your Apple, your Google, they all are using improv, right? Because particularly in the US, it's a well-known genre. Now, from what I can see, and I don't know specifically about those organizations, but generally they're using improv as a way of bringing the team together and having some fun for about half an hour, and everyone feels great. And then everyone goes back to work, and hoping that some of those elements from that will kind of, filter through, right? I haven't seen enough organizations who've made improv a part of some of their practices without calling it improv at all. Right? And if we can do that, then you just inculcate that in all the processes that we carry out, right? So, for example, I ran in fact, I'll give you two examples. The first one is with a large B2B organization where we ran some training capability development around project management, client relationship, and delivery. And as part of that, we use the typical change tools, which I'm sure you've come across, like like your RACI tool, like your milestone planning, like creating your charters. But what we did do, we also did a stakeholder map. And actually, as part of the stakeholder map, one of the things we did before that was do a little improv exercise in looking at a certain situation with many, many different eyes, right? And these are eyes of many sentients, right? So it's not just humans. We may see what does a frog think about the situation? What does a stone think about the situation? What does a fireman think about the situation? And what we built around the object was many, many views of it. And suddenly people started to see something very mundane that actually there are many positions to hold with this mundane object, which was just a tree, for example. So a woodcutter would see it very differently, a stone would see it very differently, a dog would see a tree very differently, a bird would see a tree very differently, right? And because we did that, when it came to looking at stakeholder mapping and looking at how you might map your stakeholders, this group of people suddenly started to see stakeholders beyond the obvious. And actually, they started to see that there was a bigger shape to the stakeholders. And actually, some of those stakeholders could be leveraged in their, in this pursuit of change that they would work on with clients. So, but I never called it an improv. I never even described it improv. I said, let's just try this little thing out first.
So like a warm-up.
Let's just get us warmed up. And then we'll go and do this. And actually, they loved it. They absolutely loved it. And it's so how we can inculcate that within the bigger picture. And there is now something called applied improvisation, which has got its own organization on body, which is trying to bring improv into everything outside of theater, right? So it's trying to say, let's leave the theater bit aside and let's try and see how we can use improv in day-to-day.
Perhaps just a last question on this subject, because I think you touched on it very briefly there, perhaps, but about for working with these kind of methods for yourself, have you seen any personal impact on this? Has it changed the way you approach things or how you think about the world around you?
Yeah, very, very much so. I mean, it's very interesting. The Impro Course, which I saw at City Lit, it took me about a year to sign up to it. I was absolutely petrified of even just going on a course. But within as soon as I started, I thought, my God, this is something I've been meaning to do for a long time, and it was the right thing to do, because I was very much driven, I guess, until that stage, by the fact that I worked hard, I found out the right solutions for my client, and I lived and died by it,
Yeah.
And this whole aspect of using creativity more, going into places that are unexplored and feeling comfortable was something that I always resisted because of fear of failure, even though I'd run workshops where we talk about fear of failure, but then it was still very much within a bound. Improv really removes many of these bounds. So for me, the way it's really helped me is, number one, I think my mental health is, it's probably the best it's ever been. Not that it was bad before, but it's the best it's ever been, because in any situation, doesn't matter what it is, when COVID hit, it was like another story is coming to our life. How am I going to play this story out? How am I going to make this story develop? Yeah. It was very interesting because at that time, Zoom had just started being used, and I thought, actually, there's a story here, and I started seeing a story of how Zoom could be used in the local communities where I live.
Yeah.
And actually, that's what I started pushing. And actually, funnily enough, it's being used by at least two large communities here, because I thought there's a story here that I can we can share with it. So number one, in any situation, you can continue the story, and that's really helped me. And number two, I think in conversations, you don't have to shut down conversations, even though they're uncomfortable, right? So that's okay, because you can continue the conversation and see where it leads to. Because it might lead to a much more interesting place for both of you.
Yeah, that sounds really fascinating. And feels like it's an untapped resource or an untapped way of approaching many of the challenges that organizations are facing. I'm thinking about when I'm consulting in organizations, and I imagine you find the same thing, there's perhaps an expectation that there is a right answer, that there's a template that you can apply over the top of this thing, which you and I both well understand that there is not. There's no absolute way to do that. So being able to arm our teams, our leaders, and our organization with techniques, as you say, that always give them a way of continuing the story, sounds like a richly powerful but probably frighteningly underused approach, I would suspect. Well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's just in the organizations I've been, I haven't seen it, but it certainly opened my eyes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think organizations are just not using this tool enough, because it does also shift power away, right? Because it's asking leaders to say, we're not sure where this story is going. Let's all work together to create a new story.
Yeah.
And for that, the leader has to accept that they're not sure about certain things. You speak to any leader who succeeded, and they'll tell you about the sleepless nights where they're completely uncertain about what's going to happen. I mean, they say it after the event, but if they could be more open during the event, a lot more things could emerge, right? And read any biography of a great leader, and you'll see this theme again and again and again of having to do with uncertainty, where people want certainty, having to be the leader where you yourself are not 100% sure about direction.
Thank you, Ketan. As a last point, just for anybody watching, I'll put a link to the classes, the public Impro classes you run, because I can strongly recommend that people join and come along and experience some Impro, so they can kind of feel it for themselves if they haven't. If somebody wanted to engage, let's say you've got an organization that are struggling with some challenges right now, and they think, actually, let's try this different approach. How would they engage you? What would that kind of conversation look like?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a very good example. Right now, we are working with the Red Cross Climate Change Center, long word. So this is the climate change part of the Red Cross in Africa. And the issue that they are trying to grasp and help local communities with is how to manage future risk, or how to manage risk.
Yeah.
And there's a whole host of evidence about climate change and how it's going to affect small and medium enterprises. And there's a whole host of solutions already thought through. The problem is, as soon as you try and shove solutions onto, SMEs in Africa, who don't necessarily sit in the intellectual space, it's much more complex in terms of their day-to-day life, it doesn't work. So we were tasked with, how do we help these SMEs to come up with their own ways of mitigating risk, and we're going to use, what I did is to come up with a couple of improv games that help facilitate that. So, short answer to your question is, it very much depends on where the organization is, what problems it has, around those things we spoke about. And then we tailor something that suits them. And the other thing is to try and inculcate that or include that within a larger piece that they're already doing. So rather than saying, we're going to, everybody turn up and we're going to do some improv, because it's going to really help you, is to say, we're going to run, we want to do, an activity, an intervention where we're trying to solve A, B, or C, and actually inculcate improv as part of that. And then people think, that was great. I didn't know you called it improv, but that was really good.
Yeah. How did you do that?
How did you do that? How did we come up with those ideas?
Quite, yeah. Thank you very much indeed, Ketan. I'm so grateful for the conversation, and I know we could talk about this for a while longer, no doubt. Um, I'll pop some links in the chat anyway, but for right now, I'll just say a very big thank you for the conversation, and I look forward to joining another of your classes sometime soon in the future.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Excellent.